Hello and welcome to episode 2. Today we're going to take a look at ZvZ Basics and go over positioning for each role. I thought we'd start off by looking at what a Zerg usually contains. Here we have a very simplified model of a 20-man Zerg. You have tanks in the front, melee DPS slightly behind, then the backline with healers, ranged DPS and supports. In reality, it's more complex than that and there's more overlapping going on. Experienced players will sometimes be out of formation because of their experience and skill that allows them to know when they can break the norm in order to get a better angle or position in preparation for engaging or counter-engaging, but more on that later. So let's go over positioning for tanks first. You as a tank are the front line. You will sit there with the other tanks and try to find opportunities for good engages. Most often, the shot caller will also be playing tank and he will be the one calling when to go in. Always, and I can't stress this enough, always listen to the shot caller. Even if the call ends up being bad or wrong, if half the party doesn't commit, you will never get anywhere. Remember, you are one unit, you need to act like it. This is a good time to look at a compass because some people struggle with directions. You have north, east, south, and west, or any combination of two of these. When a shot caller calls to retreat in any particular direction, you need to run in that particular direction. There are a few exceptions, of course, though, such as, for example, you get cut off from the rest of the Zerg due to whatever circumstances occur. Luckily, if you ever forget these, there's an in-game compass for reference. Alright, next up, we got melee DPS. To make this simple, let's split this category into two types. You have Galatines, and then you have everything else. Positioning for Galatine players is usually a little scuffed because you need to walk off somewhere, queue some mobs, gain stacks. Often, Galatine players even walk up to the enemy front line and start queuing tanks while the rest is doing the Mexican standoff. But you need to look for any opportunities you can to have your queue stacks up. Obviously, don't overextend and risk dying due to it. One big reason for Galatines being so far up compared to other melees is that they often use mage sandals. That means that you don't really have any mobility other than a small movement speed boost from queue stacks. You can't sprint in and drop your E like others, so you have to be at the front line. For other melee DPS, and especially beginners, I suggest sitting slightly behind the tank line. A good rule of thumb is to pay attention to your grove keepers. If you see them use their sprints, you should probably do the same. Okay, let's talk about range DPS, because even though the fundamentals stay the same, engage when your tanks do, etc., there's two big differences that you need to keep in mind. Number one, be careful what angle you drop from. Imagine the following scenario, where your tanks engage, you as a ranged DPS run up and try dropping on the first clump you see. You don't kill them, suddenly they counter-engage you and half the party dies. What went wrong here, you might ask? Well, a lot of things. Let's go over it one step at a time. The first thing is that the friendly Zerg was too far away from the enemy backline. The sprints will not reach there. This means that when the engage is eventually called, you will not have enough reach, and the only thing close enough to clap will be the enemy tanks. You never want to clap the enemy tanks, they have high resistances, they are unlikely to die, especially if they use their defenses accordingly. You always want to clap their squishy targets, that is, their ranged DPS and healers. The second thing that went wrong here is the main point of this example. All the DPS ran up and dropped from the same spot. Now this is partly not even their fault, because the further you are away from the drop, the less room you have to position at a different angle. Just compare the following. Anyway, the biggest takeaway from this is that if all the DPS run and drop from the same place, you will get clapped. The enemy grove keepers will instantly capitalize on that. And what happened in this example is that while our DPS was trying to tickle the enemy tanks, their grove jumped in and two Galatines wiped half a party. This is a real example from a past ZvZ with it. Now, there's definitely a lot more that could be said about this specific example and other ways we could have avoided this, but one way was being closer to the enemy in the first place, so our DPS had more angles to take while engaging, whether it was over the wall or deep inside the territory. And this is also a tip for the shot caller. Be mindful of roughly how far away your backline is. The second difference compared to melee DPS is that you need to be aware of your range. Essentially what we're talking about is how hard is it to drop. Something like Wailing, for example, has a long range, near instant cast time, pretty easy. you can drop your E and be on your way to reposition, depending on how the engage went. Now, if you're playing Brimstone, on the other hand, you have a slightly shorter range, you have a longer cast time, so inherently you put yourself at more risk than a Wailing, so you need to be mindful of that. I'd like to categorize ranged DPS into two classes. You have clap weapons, such as Wailing and Brimstone, where you use your E and you get away. But then you also have channeled weapons, such as, for example, Siege Bow and Longbow. If you're using a channel weapon, the number one tip I would give is that you don't always need to commit to the full channel. Sometimes cancelling it halfway through is the smart thing to do. Now, just to summarize, as a ranged DPS, you need to find unique angles, you should not clump and don't all drop from the same spot. You need to drop your E and move on. Don't stay there and look how many you killed. The second you drop your E, you need to watch for the enemy tanks. Pay attention to it. Do you need to use your Knight Helmets or other defensives in case of a counter engage? Alright, now let's talk about healers. Your job is to save your allies when they eventually fuck up the things we just talked about. No, but there will be times where your Zerg will get in trouble and get clapped. If you're a beginner healer, a good rule of thumb is to stay behind your ranged DPS. I see way too many healers who, when an engage is called, will run up as if they're doing a drop. You're not a clapper. You don't need to drop a fallen E on the enemy clump. Now this might seem obvious, but way too many healers position as if they were to drop an E on the enemy clump. You need to leave it to the experienced healers to top up the tanks. If you're a beginner, what you should do is stand behind your ranged DPS as they're dropping. Don't stand on top of them. You'll just get caught in the counter engage if it comes. And last but not least, we got supports. Most often this will just be a locus, so let's talk about that. We already mentioned defensive and offensive ways to use it in episode 1, but if you're a beginner, I highly suggest focusing on defensive ones. It's easier to spot an opportunity to use it. You see a friendly clump about to get clapped, use it on your friendly clump. Once you become more experienced with ZvZs in general, you'll be able to spot situations where you can drop your locus on enemies. Do you see an enemy clump of ranged DPS about to drop their E's? Use your locus on them. Make them deal 0 damage. Are you engaging an enemy clump? Use your locus on the enemy clump and remove their Knight Helmet buff. For example, in terms of positioning, you have a lot more freedom as a locus. If you're following the advice of using the locus defensively, then you should position roughly the same as the backline healers. When you get more experience though, as a locus, you'll realize that, honestly, you can go wherever you want. You are more independent, you're like the healers in a way. You don't have to drop your E whenever the shot caller calls to engage. An experienced locus user will sit near the front line to maximize their view and have an easier time spotting opportunities. The added bonus is that you will be both able to drop your E on enemies and on your allies, whichever you think the situation calls for. Alright, that will be all for this video. Remember to pay attention to your positioning relative to your Zerg and the enemy Zerg, and you'll be fine.